The air inside the Oakhaven Community Hall was thick with the kind of excitement that buzzes just under the skin. It was a special kind of energy, the kind that belonged to the young and the hopeful. The annual regional piano competition was more than just a contest. It was a social event for the families involved, a place to see and be seen. The hall itself, with its high ceiling and polished wooden floors, echoed with the sounds of ambition. Parents whispered last-minute words of encouragement to their children, who in turn stared at their sheet music with a mixture of terror and determination. The scent of floor polish, old velvet curtains, and a faint hint of nervous sweat hung in the air. In every corner a future prodigy was being born, or at the very least, meticulously rehearsed. Into this vibrant, youthful world, a woman stepped through the heavy double doors at the back. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate, like a sudden drop in temperature. She was, to put it mildly, out of place. At 72, her presence was a stark, monochrome photograph in a room full of glossy, colorful paintings. Her hair was a soft, snowy white, pulled back gently from a face that was a map of kind wrinkles and a lifetime of quiet expressions. She wore a simple, navy blue dress that, while clean, seemed to belong to another era. It didn't shimmer or cling. It simply hung on her small frame, offering comfort rather than style. In her hands, she clutched a folder of sheet music, its edges yellowed and soft from decades of use. The pages inside were not crisp and new, but were worn thin at the corners, bearing the faint pencil marks of 1,000 past practices. As she walked slowly down the aisle, a quiet ripple of awareness spread through the crowd. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned and eyes followed her progress. She could feel their gazes on her, a physical weight. It wasn't outright hostility, not yet. It was more profound, unspoken confusion. Who was she? Was she a grandmother who had gotten lost on her way to the restroom? A retired teacher from the music school, perhaps come to watch her former students? The whispers started as soon as she passed, little puffs of sound that she couldn't help but catch. Is she a contestant? A young mother murmured to her husband, not bothering to lower her voice. Must be some kind of novelty act, the husband replied with a soft, dismissive chuckle. For comic relief before the real talent comes on. A group of teenagers, dressed in the latest fashions, openly giggled behind their hands. One of them, a girl with bright pink hair, nudged her friend and pointed a finger, not with malice, but with the careless cruelty of the young who cannot imagine ever being old. The old woman felt a familiar flush of heat on her neck, a prickle of shame that she thought she had outgrown years ago. She kept her eyes fixed on the front of the hall, on the imposing grand piano that sat center stage like a throne. It was her destination, her only focus. She found a row of empty chairs designated for the waiting contestants and sat down at the very end, as if trying to make herself as small as possible. The chair was hard and unforgiving, its cold plastic a stark contrast to the soft, worn fabric of her dress. She placed the music folder on her lap, her hands resting on top of it like a shield. She tried to steady her breathing, to quiet the frantic drumming of her heart against her ribs. It was always like this. The anxiety, the feeling of being an imposter. It didn't matter that she had spent more years at a piano than most of these contestants had been alive. In this world, her age was a costume she couldn't take off, and it marked her as an outsider. Her mind drifted, seeking refuge in a memory. She saw herself as a young woman, no older than the pink-haired girl in the audience, sitting in the small living room of the first apartment she and her husband ever rented. There was an old, second-hand upright piano against the wall, its ivory keys yellowed, its wood scarred. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. Her husband would sit on the sofa, listening with his eyes closed, a small, contented smile on his face as she played for hours. He never pushed her to perform for anyone else. For him, her music was a private gift, a language that only they shared. You have a fire in your fingers, he used to tell her. Don't ever let it go out. But life, as it so often does, had gotten in the way. Children came, then mortgage, then jobs that demanded all her time and energy. The piano lessons were the first to go, then the daily practice. The old upright piano became a place to stack laundry, then a dusty monument to a forgotten dream. After her husband passed away 5 years ago, the silence in the house had become deafening. It was in that silence that the fire in her fingers, long dormant, had begun to flicker once more. She had found this competition in a local newspaper, and on a whim, driven by a desperate need to feel that fire again, to honor his memory, she had signed up. Now, sitting in this hard chair, she wondered if it had been a terrible mistake, the master of ceremonies. A man with a perfectly coiffed hairdo and a voice that was too smooth for its own good, walked onto the stage to a smattering of polite applause. He tapped the microphone. "Testing 1, 2, he said, his voice echoing through the hall. He ran through the rules and welcomed the judges, his words dripping with a practiced charm. Then he picked up his list of contestants. He read out the first few names, each one belonging to a fresh-faced teenager who would walk nervously onto the stage, play their piece, and walk off to a comforting hug from their parents. Then his eyes scanned down to her name. He paused for just a fraction of a second, a tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation. But she saw it. A small, curious smile played on his lips as he looked up from the paper and scanned the waiting area, his eyes landing on her. He was about to make a joke. She could feel it coming. He was going to present her as a sweet little old lady, a charming interlude. And next, he said, his voice taking on a warmer, more patronizing tone, we have a very special treat. Please give a warm welcome to Eleanor Vance. The way he said her name, with that gentle, almost pitying lilt, was worse than any open ridicule. It was the sound of being dismissed, of being made into an object of quaint curiosity. A few people in the audience tittered, exactly the reaction he had been hoping for. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands, which had been resting on her music folder, began to tremble. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air catching in her throat. This was it. There was no turning back. With a movement that felt both heavy and weightless, she pushed herself up from the hard plastic chair and began the long walk toward the stage, toward the piano, toward the judgment of 100 pairs of eyes that had already decided she wasn't worth their time. The walk from the waiting chair to the piano was the longest journey of her life. Each step on the polished wooden floor of the stage seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the hall. The lights were brighter here, hotter. They felt like a physical pressure, pushing down on her, making the simple navy blue dress feel heavy and cumbersome. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, a collective gaze that felt less like curiosity and more like a scientific examination of a strange specimen. She kept her head down, focusing on the instrument ahead. It was a beautiful grand piano, black and gleaming, its lid propped open like a giant, welcoming wing. But to her, it looked like a monster with 88 teeth. She reached the bench and paused, her hand resting on its smooth, cool surface. It was a different beast entirely from the old, upright piano she had at home. That one was familiar, a friend with scratches and faded keys that held the memory of every song she had ever played. This one was a stranger, formal and intimidating. She smoothed her dress under her and sat down, the bench making a small, squeaking sound that seemed to blast through the quiet hall like a foghorn. A few more titters came from the audience. She flinched. She placed her yellowed folder of sheet music on the stand, but she didn't open it. She knew this piece by heart. Every note, every rest, every dynamic marking was etched into her soul, a part of her as much as her own name. Her fingers, which had been trembling, now felt stiff and cold as she laid them on the ivory keys. They felt like foreign objects, disconnected from the commands in her brain. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and anticipation. She thought of her husband's face, the way he would smile when she played. Asterisk, don't ever let it go out. She closed her eyes for just a second, holding on to that image like a lifeline. Then she began to play. The piece was Franz Liszt's La Campanella, which means the little bell. The opening melody is famous for its delicate, high-pitched notes that skip and dance, mimicking the sound of a small, clear bell. To an untrained ear, it sounds simple, almost like a child's music box exercise. The first few notes rang out, clear and pure. They hung in the air, fragile and alone. Eleanor concentrated, her world shrinking to the space between her fingers and the keys. She was trying to find her footing, to connect with the music, to block out the world, but the world was not ready to be blocked out. From the third row, a man's voice, a stage whisper designed to be heard, cut through the delicate notes. "She's playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bell," he murmured to his wife. A poorly concealed joke that earned a snort of laughter from her. The sound of that laughter was like a stone thrown into the still water of her concentration. The ripples spread instantly. A group of teenagers near the back, the ones who had giggled before, didn't even try to hide their amusement now. One of them let out a loud, exaggerated yawn. Another pretended to conduct her with a waving French fry, a leftover from a snack bought earlier. The whispers grew from a gentle rustle to a steady, buzzing hum. They were like a swarm of gnats, impossible to ignore, biting at her focus. Eleanor's fingers faltered. A note, meant to be crisp and clear, came out muffled and slightly off-key. A small mistake, but in the charged silence of a performance hall, it sounded like a crash of cymbals. This only fueled the audience's derision. The man in the third row shook his head, a look of pitying condescension on his face. The master of ceremonies, watching from the wings, crossed his arms. A small, satisfied smile touched his lips. He had been right. She was a quaint little novelty act, and her moment was almost over. He was already thinking about how he would gently guide her off the stage and introduce the next, more serious contestant. The shame was a physical thing. A hot wave that washed over Eleanor, starting from her toes and rising up to scald her cheeks. Her heart, which had been beating a steady rhythm of nervousness, now hammered against her ribs with a frantic, panicked beat. "They're right," a voice inside her head whispered, a voice that sounded suspiciously like her own worst fears. "Asterisk, you're a fool." An old woman playing a child song. "Who do you think you're kidding?" Asterisk, her fingers felt clumsy, swollen. The simple melody she was playing, which should have been effortless, now felt like climbing a mountain. Each note was a struggle. The music, which was supposed to be her escape, had become her prison. The delicate bell-like sounds she was creating now seemed to mock her, highlighting her inadequacy. She could feel the judgment of the crowd pressing down on her, a heavy, suffocating blanket. They weren't just watching her fail. They were enjoying it. She had become a brief, amusing spectacle in their evening, a story they would tell later with a chuckle. "Did you see that old lady at the piano tonight?" She played another few bars, her movements robotic, devoid of any feeling or artistry. She was just going through the motions, her mind a fog of humiliation. The whispers grew louder, more confident. Someone coughed loudly, right in the middle of a quiet phrase. It was an act of deliberate disrespect. Eleanor's shoulders slumped. The fight went out of her. The fire her husband had spoken of, the flicker she had been trying to nurture for 5 long years, felt like it was about to be extinguished by a cold, brutal wind of ridicule. Her hands came to a stop, hovering over the keys. The music died in the middle of a phrase, leaving a sudden, gaping silence in the hall. The silence was even worse than the whispers. It was an accusatory silence, heavy and final. She had failed. She had proven them all right. She sat there, frozen, a small, defeated woman in a navy blue dress, staring at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. The audience stirred, a collective shifting in their seats, the sound of people preparing to politely applaud her failed effort and move on. The end felt inevitable. She had come here to prove something, to honor a memory, and instead she had become a joke. The silence that followed her stopped music was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was an awkward, waiting silence, the kind that waits for someone to finally stand up and applaud politely so everyone can go home. Eleanor sat frozen, her hands hovering over the keys like pale, frightened birds. The weight of 100 stares pressed down on her, each one a tiny judgment. She could feel the hot prickle of shame on her neck, a familiar, unwelcome companion from her school days. The man in the third row was already leaning back in his seat, a smug little smile on his face as if to say, "I knew it." The teenagers were whispering again, their giggles like sharp little needles. The master of ceremonies took a half-step forward from the wings, his hand raised, ready to step in and offer a few condescending words of comfort before ushering her off the stage. Her shoulders slumped forward, the fight draining out of her completely. The fire her husband had always spoken of, the flicker she had tried so hard to keep alive for 5 long years, felt like it was sputtering out, leaving nothing but a wisp of smoke. They were right, the voice in her head whispered, louder and more insistent now. You're a fool. An old woman pretending to be something she's not. Go home, Eleanor. Just go home. She was about to push herself up from the bench to accept her defeat and disappear into the shadows. But then something strange happened. As her gaze fell, unfocused, onto the black and white keys, a memory surfaced, not as a gentle thought, but as a vivid, overwhelming flood. It wasn't just a picture in her mind. It was a full-blown sensory experience. She was no longer on a brightly lit stage in a community hall. She was in the small, cozy living room of her old apartment, the air thick with the sweet, earthy smell of her husband's pipe, tobacco, and the scent of rain on the WSIL. The grand piano in front of her transformed into their old second-hand upright, its wood scarred and familiar. She could almost feel the worn, slightly fuzzy texture of the keys beneath her fingers. And she could hear his voice, not as a distant echo, but as if he were sitting right there on the sofa behind her. "You have a fire in your fingers, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low, warm rumble. "Don't ever let it go out. Not for anyone." She remembered one evening in particular. She had been struggling with a difficult piece, her fingers clumsy and her patience worn thin. She had slammed her hands down on the keys in frustration, a jarring, discordant noise that filled the small room. "I can't do it," she had cried, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "It's too hard. I'm not good enough." He hadn't said anything at first. He had just walked over, knelt down beside the piano bench, and taken her hands in his. His hands were large and calloused from his work as a mechanic, but his touch was always gentle. He looked at her, his eyes full of a love so deep it made her ache. "Good enough for who?" he had asked softly. "This music, it's not for them. It's not for some critic or some competition. It's for you. It's for us. It's the part of your soul that you can't put into words. When you play, I can hear your heart singing. Don't ever let anyone, especially yourself, tell you that your heart can't sing." The memory was so real, so powerful, that it felt like a physical touch. A single, hot tear escaped from the corner of her eye and traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. But this wasn't a tear of shame or defeat. It was a tear of remembrance, of love, and of a sudden, fierce, burning resolve. The voice of doubt in her head was silenced by his voice. A voice that had been a part of her for over 50 years. Not for them, she thought, her back straightening almost imperceptibly. This isn't for them. A strange calm settled over her. The heat in her cheeks cooled, replaced by a steady, quiet warmth that spread through her chest. The frantic, panicked beating of her heart slowed to a strong, purposeful rhythm. The hundreds of eyes watching her seemed to fade away, their judgment becoming meaningless. The master of ceremonies, still waiting in the wings, became a blur. The whispers of the audience turned into a distant, irrelevant hum. Her world shrank until it contained only 2 things, the memory of her husband's love and the 88 keys in front of her. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer trembling. They were steady. They were old hands, to be sure, with thin skin and prominent veins, but they were her hands, and they held a lifetime of music. She slowly, deliberately placed them back on the keys. The ivory felt cool and solid beneath her fingertips, a promise of what was to come. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in fear, but in focus. She took a deep, slow breath, filling her lungs completely, and then let it out, and then she began to play again. She started from the very beginning, the same simple, bell-like melody that had earned her such ridicule just moments before. But this time it was different. The notes were not hesitant or fragile. They were clear, pure, and filled with a quiet, unshakable confidence. Each note was placed with a deliberate precision that commanded attention. It was no longer the sound of a child's music box. It was the sound of a single, clear voice speaking in a crowded room, demanding to be heard. A confused hush fell over the hall. The whispers died instantly. The man in the third row, who had been smirking, now sat forward in his seat, his brow furrowed. The teenagers in the back stopped their giggling and leaned in, their expressions shifting from mockery to curiosity. The master of ceremonies froze, his hands still half raised. A look of complete bewilderment on his face, Eleanor played the simple melody through once, her expression serene, her focus absolute. It was a statement. It was as if she was telling the audience, "You thought this was simple? You thought this was a joke? Let me show you what this simple melody can become." And then it happened. She reached the end of the opening phrase, and her right hand, which had been playing the delicate high notes, leaped down the keyboard. At the same time, her left hand came in with a series of deep, resonant chords. The effect was immediate and stunning. The simple bell-like melody was still there, ringing out clearly in the highest registers, but now it was no longer alone. It was supported, underpinned, and surrounded by a current of immense, complex power. The first cascade of lightning-fast arpeggios, a series of notes requiring incredible speed and dexterity, shot through the hall like a bolt of white lightning. The sound was breathtaking. It was a storm of beauty and power, a sudden, violent explosion of music that no one, least of all the audience, had seen coming. The confused silence in the hall deepened into one of profound, stunned awe. The woman who, just a minute ago, had been a trembling, ridiculed failure, was now a force of nature, and the entire hall was held captive in the eye of her storm. The silence that fell over the hall was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of absolute, total concentration. It was a heavy, palpable thing, thick with disbelief. The storm of music that Eleanor had unleashed was not just loud. It was complex, a dizzying tapestry of sound that the audience had no preparation for. The simple, bell-like melody, the one they had mocked, was still there, a constant, sparkling thread of light running through the chaos. But now it was caught in a hurricane. Her left hand, which had seemed so weak and hesitant before, now pounded out deep, resonant chords that provided a thunderous foundation, a heartbeat for the storm. Her right hand, however, was the true marvel. It was a blur of motion, a dancer moving at impossible speeds, leaping across the keyboard with a precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Eleanor herself was transformed. The woman who had shuffled onto the stage, her shoulders slumped in defeat, was gone. In her place was a musician in her element, a conductor of a symphony for 88 keys. Her back was straight, her posture perfect. Her head was slightly bowed, her eyes closed, but her face was no longer a mask of fear. It was serene, yet intense, as if she were channeling something far greater than herself. She was no longer thinking about the audience, or the judges, or the smug master of ceremonies. She was lost in the music, and in the memory of the man who had always believed in her. Every note was a conversation with him, a testament to a love that had never faded. The fire in her fingers, which he had so admired, was now a raging inferno, and she was letting it burn. In the third row, the man who had whispered the cruel joke was now leaning so far forward he was in danger of falling out of his seat. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and sheer bewilderment. He looked at his wife, who was staring at the stage with a hand covering her mouth, and he could only shake his head slowly. He had no words. The condescending smirk had been wiped clean from his face, replaced by a dawning realization that he had just witnessed a miracle. He felt a small, uncomfortable pang of shame, a feeling that he had been a part of the ridicule that had almost extinguished this incredible light. The group of teenagers in the back was utterly silent. The girl with the bright pink hair, who had been so full of careless mockery, now sat with her elbows on her knees, her chin resting in her hands, completely captivated. Her phone, which had been in her hand just moments before, lay face down and forgotten on the seat beside her. She had never heard anything like it. It wasn't the kind of music she listened to, with its heavy beats and auto-tuned vocals. This was different. It was raw, it was real, and it was terrifyingly beautiful. She was watching an old woman, someone she would have normally ignored, create something so powerful, so full of life, that it made her own world feel small and temporary. For the first time that evening, she wasn't bored. She was mesmerized. Even the judges, who had seen countless young prodigies with flawless technique, were visibly shaken. They had leaned forward, their pens forgotten on the table in front of them. They were not analyzing anymore. They were simply experiencing. One of the judges, a stern woman with a reputation for being brutally honest, had a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She wasn't just hearing a technically perfect performance. She was hearing a story. She was hearing the story of a lifetime of passion, of dreams deferred, of a love that transcended time and death. This wasn't just a display of skill. It was an act of pure, unadulterated soul. Bearing. The music continued to build, growing ever more complex and daring. Eleanor's hands moved in a breathtaking counterpoint, one playing a frantic, cascading melody in the high registers while the other maintained a powerful, driving rhythm far below. It was like watching two different people playing at the same time, yet they were perfectly synchronized, two halves of a single, brilliant whole. The sound filled every corner of the hall, vibrating in the wooden floors, in the velvet curtains, in the very bones of the audience. It was a sound that was both delicate and overwhelming, a whisper that roared. The master of ceremonies stood frozen in the wings, his carefully constructed persona of a charming host in tatters. His script, his jokes, his entire plan for the evening had become meaningless. He was supposed to be the one who controlled the flow of emotion in the room, but he had been utterly sidelined. He was just another spectator now, watching helplessly as this old woman, this novelty act, single-handedly dismantled the entire atmosphere of the competition and replaced it with something far more profound. He felt a strange mix of professional panic and personal awe. He had misjudged her completely, and in doing so, he had almost been a party to silencing something truly extraordinary. As the piece approached its most difficult passage, a series of rapid, octopus-like jumps that required immense strength and accuracy, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. This was the part that separated the good from the great, the amateurs from the artists. Eleanor's fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion that seemed almost too fast for the eye to follow. The notes came out in a torrent, a waterfall of sound that was both chaotic and perfectly controlled. It was the sound of a life lived to the fullest, with all its joys and sorrows, its triumphs and its heartbreaks, all poured out in a single, breathtaking moment. The audience was no longer a collection of individuals. They were a single, unified entity, bound together by the shared experience of witnessing the impossible. They were no longer just listening to a piano performance. They were being swept away by a force of nature, and they had no idea when or how the storm would end. The final passage of the music was a maelstrom, a dizzying, breathtaking storm of sound that seemed to pull all the air out of the room. Eleanor's hands were a blur, a fusion of power and grace that defied her age, defied logic, defied the very expectations of the audience who had so cruelly misjudged her. The notes cascaded down the keyboard in a shimmering, intricate waterfall of sound, each one perfectly placed, each one filled with a lifetime of unspoken emotion. It was the sound of joy and sorrow, of love and loss, of a fire that had been banked for decades but had never, ever gone out. Then, as the storm reached its absolute peak, she brought both hands down for the final, triumphant chord. The sound was immense. A great resonant wave that filled the entire hall, shaking the very foundations of the building. It hung in the air, shimmering and powerful, a single perfect moment of sonic architecture. And then it began to fade, the overtones vibrating and dissolving slowly, slowly, until there was nothing left, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was a thick, heavy, living thing. It was the sound of 100 people collectively forgetting to breathe. No one moved. No one spoke. In the third row, the man who had mocked her was frozen, his hand halfway to his mouth, his eyes wide with a dawning, humbling awe. The teenagers in the back, who had been a picture of bored apathy, were now statues of pure concentration, their faces illuminated by the stage lights, their expressions a mixture of shock and wonder. The judges sat motionless, their pens lying forgotten on the table, their professional composure shattered by the raw, unfiltered humanity of what they had just witnessed. The master of ceremonies stood in the wings, his script a useless piece of paper in his hand, his face a mask of utter disbelief. The silence stretched on, 5 seconds, 10, an eternity. It was a sacred space, a moment of profound collective realization. The audience was not just processing the music. They were processing their own judgment, their own prejudice. They were understanding, in a sudden, gut-wrenching flash, that they had almost been a party to silencing something truly extraordinary. They had ridiculed a masterpiece in the making, then a single sound broke the spell. It was a clap. One solitary clap. It came from the third row. It was the man. He brought his hand down on his knee with a sound that was sharp and definite in the profound quiet. It wasn't polite applause. It was an acknowledgement, an act of penance, a statement that said, "I was wrong and I am sorry." That single clap was the spark that lit the bonfire. Another person joined in, then another. A woman in the front row let out a choked sob, which turned into a cry of "Brava!" Then, like a dam breaking, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a physical, emotional explosion. It was a roar of sound so loud, so powerful, that it seemed to push back against the walls. People were on their feet, their faces wet with tears, their hands raw from clapping. They were shouting, not just "Bravo," but her name. Eleanor! 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 The name they had whispered with condescension was now being chanted with reverence. On the stage, Eleanor seemed to be waking from a deep sleep. The storm of music had carried her away to another place, another time, a small living room filled with the memory of her husband's love. As the last note faded, she had remained with her eyes closed, her hands resting on the keys, her body still humming with the vibration of the music. The first clap made her flinch, but the ensuing roar was like a physical force that pulled her back to the present. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the bright lights. She saw the hall, no longer a sea of critical faces, but a standing, cheering, weeping ovation. She saw the man in the third row, clapping with a fierce, desperate energy. She saw the teenagers, their faces alight with an emotion she couldn't quite name, but knew was respect. She saw the judges, on their feet, their faces filled with an awe that was more personal than professional. A look of pure, unadulterated confusion crossed her face. It was as if she couldn't quite connect the roaring crowd with the quiet, frail woman who had walked onto the stage just minutes before. She slowly, carefully lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. She looked down at them as if seeing them for the first time, as if wondering where all that music had come from. The master of ceremonies, his professional mask completely gone, walked slowly onto the stage. He didn't go to the microphone. He simply walked over to Eleanor, his movements tentative, full of a respect that was palpable. He didn't speak. He just stood beside her, a silent witness, sharing in her moment. Eleanor finally seemed to understand. The sound wasn't for someone else. It was for her. A slow, shy smile spread across her face, a smile that transformed her, making her look years younger, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears. She pushed herself up from the bench, her legs a little shaky. She turned to face the audience, and the roar intensified. She gave a small, humble bow, not like a conquering hero, but like a simple woman who was deeply, profoundly grateful. She placed a hand over her heart, a gesture of thanks that needed no words. As she walked off the stage, the applause followed her, a wave of sound that washed over her, no longer a judgment but a blessing. The man in the third row reached out and his hand brushed her arm as she passed, a silent, heartfelt apology. The teenagers watched her go, their expressions thoughtful, their world perhaps a little bit bigger than it had been before. Backstage, in the quiet away from the roar, Eleanor leaned against the cool wall of the corridor and closed her eyes. She could still feel the vibration of the final chord in her bones. She could still hear her husband's voice, not as a memory, but as a presence. Asterisk, I can hear your heart singing, Ellie. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep within her soul, that he had heard it too. She hadn't just played a piano that night. She had kept a promise. She had let the fire burn, and in doing so, she had not only shocked an entire hall, but she had finally, truly set herself free.